Wonderful. All right, why don't we get started? I know people are trickling in, but they don't necessarily have to hear me. They're eager to hear from our panelists. So let me begin by welcoming everybody. Thank you for joining us today. My name is Ilan Berman. I'm the Senior Vice President of the American Foreign Policy Council. Our discussion today is going to be on the state of the Islamic State. The past, present, and future of the world's most notorious terrorist group. Today's event, as well as other events that we're planning, which I'll mention in a second, are tied very closely to one of the American Foreign Policy Council's flagship programs, the World Almanac of Islamism. For those of you that might not be familiar with it, the Almanac is one of our keystone projects. It's a print and multimedia project that is designed to track the rise, decline, and change in Islamist movements, Islamist trends on a local, regional, and global level over time. And we are now in the process of putting the finishing touches on our 2021 edition. The vast majority of those chapters are already online, and you can see them at almanac.afpc.org. And the print edition of the Almanac, when all is compiled, will be out in the first quarter of 2021. Many of the insights that are contained within the Almanac are the result of a very formidable stable of scholars and authors and world-class experts that we've brought together to help us populate this really sort of Herculean endeavor. I'm delighted that 3 of those people have accepted my invitation to join us today to talk about the past, present, and future of the Islamic State. Let me do just some very brief introductions at the outset, and we can sort of delve into their areas of expertise as we go. Craig Whiteside is an associate professor of national security affairs at the Naval Postgraduate School in Monterey, California. He is the author with Haroru Ingram and Charlie Winter of an excellent new book called The ISIS Reader, which looks at the movement in its own words in terms of its strategic objectives and its global outlook. Alberto Fernandez is vice president of the Middle East Media Research Institute, MEMRI. He returned to MEMRI this summer after a 3-year stint as the president of the Middle East Broadcasting Networks, which is the US government's official news organization for the Arab world. So we will definitely be talking about media and messaging for sure today. And last but most definitely not least, Catherine Zimmerman is a resident fellow at the American Enterprise Institute and an advisor to AEI's Critical Threats Program. She specializes in the global Salafi Jihadi network, as well as related trends in Africa and the Middle East. So guys, thank you for joining me today. And before we get started, let me just sort of flesh out a couple of administrative notes for the audience participants. As you'll notice, the chat function for all attendees has been disabled. If you have a question for the speakers, please use the Q&A feature at the bottom of your pages. I'm going to curate the questions and ask them when we get to that point in our program. And I apologize in advance if we don't get a chance to get to all of the questions. But as you'll see, we have a very dynamic conversation to come. And that's precisely what it's going to be. Rather than asking Craig and Alberto and Katie to give formal presentations, I wanted to structure this more as a conversation where we look at the sort of the long arc of ISIS history and sort of where we're heading. I find conversations much more dynamic than canned speeches, and I wanted to give them an opportunity to sort of to say what's on their mind about what they're seeing and what they're tracking in their portfolios. And last point, the program is being recorded, as the participants and the audience members know. We will be posting the recording shortly, within a day or so, on the American Foreign Policy Council's website, afpc.org, as well as on AFPC's dedicated YouTube channel. And you should all receive emails about the recording and where to find it once it is live. And I hope that you guys will share the recording and we'll sort of share the insights as well. So without further ado, let me turn this over to my panelists. I'm going to sort of serve in the in the capacity of a moderator, and I think, pardon me, and I think I want to start by saying, by looking at sort of the formative events that brought ISIS to global prominence. And really, I think I want to start with a question for Craig. In the ISIS Reader, you and your co-authors spend a lot of time looking at the sort of the seminal ideas that ended up being translated into policy, that became first the Islamic State of Iraq, and then eventually, sort of through iterations, into the Islamic State of Iraq and al-Shams, and now what we know as IS. Can you talk for a minute about the foundational ideology and the worldview of ISIS and the group's objectives? You know, what were they trying to accomplish? And broadly speaking, how did they see the world? How did they see what they were building?
Thank you, Lon. Thanks for having me, and thanks for highlighting the work that we did in ISIS Reader, and I'll try to use that as a springboard to answer that particular question. And it's a difficult question because there are a lot of aspects that don't change, and yet there are a lot of other aspects that are continually evolving and sometimes surprising for analysts of the group, I think. So looking at the group longitudinally, I think, is helpful, and something that we advocate and kind of stress, as opposed to kind of a segmented approach that you a lot of times see, like, oh, Al-Qaeda in Iraq, oh, the Islamic State, and something in between, but we're not sure. So that's helpful, but at the same time, it does kind of provoke us. It kind of provides some challenges for us. We look at that group in 4 different periods, and so I'll try to highlight how some of these things have changed and how some of them haven't, like their ideology obviously has not changed. But their initial growth is one phase, then their defeat, and then restructuring, rethinking, their drive to the caliphate, and then defeat and adjustment again. So those are kind of 4 different periods that aren't super sharply delineated, but do help us try to understand these changes. These periods build on each other. There's no sense looking at the caliphate period without understanding how they built what was Al-Qaeda in Iraq that then transitions to the Islamic State of Iraq. If you notice, the Al-Mala documents were released by the US government this past week, and the CTC had a presentation on them. If you notice, the current caliph joined in 2007 during this transition period from Al-Qaeda in Iraq to the Islamic State of Iraq, and he joins after it's declared. So it's quite possible that the ideological drive to create a proto-state called the Islamic State of Iraq, which eventually becomes the caliphate, is an enticing recruitment tool for people like him, right? Even as the group is failing and meeting massive challenges in 2007, which is, we see the advent of the awakening and the surge of American and coalition forces in Iraq. So it's a really interesting aspect. We'll start with the ideology. That I'm not going to cover or think too much about it. It's been well covered. I don't think they're that much different than Al-Qaeda, except for the emphasis on takfir, which has driven some of their strategic influence. It's been an influence on their strategy for sure. Worldview, you asked about worldview, which I'm always interested in. It is different from Al-Qaeda, even if the ideology is fairly similar. Sectarianism, for example, has played a fairly famous and most people understand that role in differentiating. But also they see groups like the Muslim Brotherhood as a distinct threat to their revolutionary ideas. So they've kind of run a quiet or not so quiet campaign of assassinating and coming after Muslim Brotherhood members in the Iraqi Islamic Party and in other venues. So the worldview is different, but it also has been relatively static. What's changed is their strategy. Their strategies have changed, one, because their environment has constantly changed. The people who are working against them have changed. they've been focused a lot more, and certainly in contrast to Al-Qaeda, they've been a lot more focused on local aspects. So dominating social structures like tribes, criminal activity, education, mosques, using terror and other types of attacks against government targets, almost to shape the environment, but really focusing their efforts on dominating local politics and power structures. So, and that's where their irregular warfare strategy, or their strategy of using irregular warfare, assassinations, coercions, is pretty key. But so is building up local governance structures. Again, the new caliph, to go back to the news about the new caliph and what came out of his interrogation reports, he's recruited out of a Quranic studies program at Mosul University in 2007, if he's not groomed long before that. So in his interrogations, he talks about a good focus of some of his discussions are how they're co-opting and recruiting and trying to bring over other resistance groups in 2007, which does feed into a really good question, which is how has that strategy, how was that effective in them establishing that caliphate in 2014? And we provide a blueprint for that in the ISIS Reader and the Fallujah Memorandum of 2009, late 2009. It's their strategic document. It's a long chapter in our book of mostly primary sources, but it's a political strategy first, right? It's got some discussion of guerrilla warfare and how they're going to reduce the Iraqi military and security forces, but it's largely about how do they win the political battles between their rivals, their Sunni resistance rivals, and the Muslim Brotherhood on the more political side. And I think honing this really effective basket of strategies is what helped make them successful in Syria, help them establish the caliphate, and be relatively successful in Syria. And lastly, based off of that, this is what I think they're exporting globally. I'm sure Katie will talk about it, but they're exporting some type of ideas and methodology as much as they are, or maybe more than they are, financial support, certainly media support, which I'm sure Alberto would talk about, but largely it's this methodology of how they do business, which is quite different than I think people understand it, or they use management of savagery as a kind of a shortcut to understand it, but it's fairly dated and it doesn't have the specificity that this group has developed through their actions. So thank you.
So thanks, Craig. That is, I think, a great sort of opener for our discussion. You did call out Alberto on the media stuff, so let me follow the trend here and ask the following question, Alberto, if you don't mind. The media, one of the most unique things that we've seen over the last 6 years or so in terms of ISIS is that ISIS has really pioneered this revolutionary and enormously compelling media message. And it's one of the, for my mind, one of the distinguishing factors that distinguishes it as a later, better iteration of Al-Qaeda in terms of being able to win hearts and minds in the Muslim world. Can you sort of talk a little bit, both in your current role and also obviously in your prior government role, what did you see in terms of how they were messaging, in terms of what they were saying, and how effective those messages were? Wait, let me unmute you, if you don't mind, and then I'll let you talk.
Okay. A little bit of history. I think, looking at the ISIS media phenomenon, part of it, I think, is what happened was luck, was serendipity. Part of it was very, very intentional, very conscious. For me, I think you look at when the Islamic State becomes a true global media phenomenon, it is Syria that turbocharges that. You can almost draw a line between ISIS focused mostly on Iraq, and ISIS focused, obviously ISIS in Iraq, there were non-Iraqis in ISIS. There were, many in the Islamic State. Al-Qaeda in Iraq, there were thousands of non-Iraqis. But it doesn't become the massive media global phenomenon until Syria. Syria is what takes, elements which already existed. We remember, the famous 2005 letter from Zawahiri to Abu Musab al-Zarqawi, media is more than half the battle. It is an interesting letter because he's actually chiding Zarqawi, don't do this. And what does the Islamic State do? They do exactly what he tells them not to do. But it's in 2013 where whatever they've done is turbocharged and is internationalized in Syria. Syria is the land of promises, of end times promise. Syria is the land of Dabiq. Syria is the land of the white minaret. The battle between good and evil. Syria is also the first social media war, as we've come to dub it, with all the bells and whistles of activists doing social media, hashtag Fridays, all of that type of found footage and all of that. And third, Syria is an international phenomenon that attracts people from throughout the world and attracts social media interests, kind of online communities of interest from throughout the world, to the Muslim world especially. So you get intense Muslim interest in this unjust phenomenon of Assad slaughtering Muslims, etc. And the Islamic State is able to glom onto that. It's able to take people on. That's where it goes from messaging in 1 or 2 languages to messaging in 8 languages and 9 languages, languages as exotic as Uyghur. That all happens in Syria. And they're very much able to kind of latch on to a kind of rising sense of something we've become very used to now, which is kind of the online world, the virtual world. And as I said, they're able to take advantage of communities of interest online that already exist. It's kind of crazy to remember that this rise, 2013, 2014 especially, occurs at a time when the internet, social media platforms are completely open. ISIS in 2013, 2014, until the end of 2014 when they start lopping heads off of Americans. Before that, its online media environment on Twitter, on Facebook, on YouTube, everywhere is untouched by law enforcement, untouched by the IC, untouched in the sense of taking it down or eliminating it or any censorship or anything like that. So they're able to kind of use this kind of revolutionary message in a revolutionary way, and very much, I think, capture a bit of the zeitgeist towards youth. Here is everything that you want for kind of deracinated, globalized, urban youth, Muslim youth, converts. You get one part Ibn Taymiyyah, one part Hollywood / video game. You have sex and violence, you have faith, you have inspiration, you have dudes in black uniforms. All of the shallowness, what I think Heckhammer's called the cultural emotional environment or appeal of jihadism. They latch onto that. So you see crazy things. You see people who don't speak Arabic who became a Muslim yesterday, and they're talking in this argot, this English, Islamic English, and they'll talk about, the takfir, the taghut on this guy, or this murtad, in English. So it's very much kind of appealing in a kind of parasitical way to a certain environment, a kind of a socio-political, cultural environment that they're able to take advantage of, which peaks in 2014, 2015 especially. That's when social media companies began to take it down. And then that begins the transition into Telegram, where they're forced off of those other platforms and they move on to Telegram. And now you can say you're in the third phase of ISIS propaganda, where lots of pathways, lots of platforms have been closed off to them. They certainly don't have the kind of permissive environment that they had in 2013, 2014, with the rise of the caliphate and all of that. But despite their battlefield defeats, they have been able to kind of maintain a critical core to be able to do messaging. They're under much more pressure today, just like they are on the battlefield in Iraq and in other places. There are much more pressure on them in the social media space, in the propaganda space. They're not able to produce the splendid, incredible, propaganda efforts that they did at their height when they actually had studios in Mosul and Raqqa and all of this. But they still are able to surge when they need to surge their message. They produced a couple of months ago, almost hour-long critique in Yemen, ISIS Yemen on Al-Qaeda. They're able to, when they need to get something out, whether it's war of attrition or whatever, despite the disruption, despite what kind of international, IC community people do to them, they're able to get their message out. All of the elements that existed at their height are still there. I think they have some problems in the revolutionary aspect of their message. They're still able to attract and radicalize people in the West, kind of young men who don't seem to have any kind of reason to be radicalized. They're still able to do that. We saw a guy in Miami yesterday, kind of arrested for that, a Cuban-American guy who's a propagandist for them. For ISIS now, this is after the death of Baghdadi, after the fall of Mosul, after the fall of Raqqa. I do think they have a danger. I'm going to close with this point. They have all the elements of the great media success, more or less. They still are there, not in as massive a way as they were at their height, but the ability to surge is still there. I think the question in their messaging is the revolutionary aspect of their messaging today seems to me to lack a kind of the newness, the brilliancy, the hope of a brave new world, kind of utopian dimension that was so powerful in 2013, 2014. The attraction is still there, but a lot of their messaging now is kind of inside baseball. It's about them and Al-Qaeda, which makes sense if you're talking about kind of a closed circle of people, but when you're talking about attracting outsiders or kind of having a very clear revolutionary message, I think their message has lost a little bit of its luster today. Although the power for them to, if opportunities are given to them, to surge and to return to the kind of ISIS height that they had, is there. The possibility is still there.
No, I think that's a wonderful description. I want to circle back to that actually in terms of sort of the vibrancy of the message, because it has a tremendous amount of salience to sort of what we see as a threat moving forward. But it bears noting, right, since we're still talking about the sort of the formative trends that put together the caliphate in the first place, that message that you described, that initial message, was enormously compelling and enormously mobilizing. During the course of its short-lived experiment in self-rule, the Islamic State managed to amass a lot of money, a lot of territory, but it also managed to amass this uniquely powerful international cohort of fighters from more than 80 different countries who sort of came together. So I wanted to sort of to pick Katie's brain a little bit and sort of to talk about that that group that was animated and mobilized by those same ideological messages that were promulgated by the Islamic State that Alberto talked about. How big was it? Where did they come from? What was motivating them, right? What made them tick?
Thanks, Alon, and thanks for pulling this together. When we look at the Islamic State's messaging, I think it goes back to what Craig pointed out when we started this session. It's the ideology and the way that the Islamic State was able to package that with its strategy and then actually demonstrate success of that strategy on the ground. Certainly the Syrian civil war and the state of the fight at that point helped to throw some fuel on the fire. But when we look at what the Islamic State did that was so fundamentally different from Al-Qaeda, and the ability to attract foreign fighters from the world into Iraq and Syria was just the ability to put it onto social media and tap into those online communities, the ones that Alberto was mentioning. And when we're talking about the numbers here, we're talking estimates of 30 to 40,000 people going into the territory that was the caliphate inside Iraq and Syria. That's significant. About half of those were from the Middle East and North Africa, 16% from Europe. When we're looking at how foreign fighters have been mobilized before, the percentage coming from nearby Europe was significantly higher than any other fight before. And that is also why we saw our European partners very afraid when they started to see the Islamic State networks forming back in their home countries, France, Belgium, etc. So, just looking at where the Islamic State pulled from, it was not too different from where other foreign fighters have come from before. Tunisia was a main feeder. Tunisia has historically been a main feeder of foreign fighters. When you look at the Al-Qaeda in Iraq, Tunisians made up a significant portion of the foreign fighters that went into Iraq at that point. So there were established pipelines that went from North Africa into Syria and then across the border into Iraq. And so when we needed fighters inside of Syria, of course, those pipelines were easy to reactivate just 10 years, not even 10 years later. The more concerning ones include France. Up to 1,600 fighters from France went into Iraq and Syria, and now that's the big question, right? What do you do with the foreign fighters that are still alive, that are French nationals? And it's a big debate for the US administration and our allies abroad as we're talking about repatriating fundamentally individuals who've engaged in terrorist activity and who might be ideologically bought into the Islamic State. It's very rare that you see pure ideologues change their mind simply because the fight is over. To them, this is a phased engagement, and I think that's part of why we're seeing the Islamic State messaging as we are right now. It's preparing for its next stage of the fight. The other concerns are, of course, from the UK, we had upwards of 700 fighters going there. Most famously, the Beatles. The US is about to prosecute 2 of the fighters that are still alive from the 4 British men who are holding hostages. And I think interestingly though, there were only 100 or so from the United States. And I think as we're looking at why foreign fighters left and how many ended up, part of it of course is the difficulty of hopping on a flight from the United States and having to go into Europe and then traversing the continent through Turkey into Iraq or Syria, or coming in from the south versus moving through from a European country and going through Turkey. But part of it I also think is that the United States has done a lot to incorporate our population, where we don't have the same alienation of immigrant populations that you see in some places of Europe, where being American is simply a birthright if you're born here, or if you pass you get your citizenship, you're considered to be a full-blooded American, versus in some states in Europe, the idea is a little bit more different. And kind of you can see those stark differences in France as playing out as well. The majority of the fighters answered the ideological call. Of course, there were some who just wanted to be on the battlefield. I'm not as worried about those. But the ideology that the caliphate put out is quite powerful. And the idea of the caliphate is something that resonates with Muslims worldwide. And we're concerned about those that went to Iraq and Syria to fight with ISIS for obvious reasons. But the Islamic State opened up the rat's nest of what the caliphate is. And the Islamic State is not the only group that wants to establish the caliphate. Al-Qaeda, of course, has that in its repertoire, and the end state vision for Al-Qaeda is to eventually get to the same state that the Islamic State was in. But so does Turkey, Iran, Saudi Arabia. They each envision themselves to be part of the Muslim world and leading the Muslim world, and eventually getting to the point where that caliphate will come back. Maybe not in the same terms as the Islamic State does, but we're looking at neo-Ottomanism today from Turkey. The Persian Empire is still something that the Iranian regime harkens back to. And for Saudi Arabia, the religious credentials of being on the Arabian Peninsula and leading the Sunni Muslim world is still there. So there was a lot of discussion about this caliphate idea. And if you read the Quran, when the caliphate is established, as a good Muslim, you are supposed to go there. So there is some kind of religious preference there. And I think when we're looking at those who were radicalized and joined the Islamic State, they were radicalized because they saw this as their religious duty to go to fight jihad. I think that's something that gets missed in the debate when we cast these individuals just as terrorists. Terrorism is one of the tactics that they use. And when we look at how the Islamic State was calling to action, it wasn't just calling fighters. It was calling for doctors, engineers, and propagandists, and others who can bring skills into the Iraq and Syria battle space. So I'm going to leave it there because I think that that sets us up for a broader discussion. Now that we've had all the foreign fighters go into the Iraq and Syria space, what does that mean for the ISIS network globally as they're coming out of this?
Oh, thanks, Katie. That's perfect. And by the way, so I think this leads very nicely into sort of what happened, right? And so sort of the creation of the caliphate and then its dissolution. An administrative note, before we get there. I apologize for some of the audio. If some of you heard something that sounded suspiciously like the pitter patter of little feet, it's because that's exactly what it was, because it's the end of the school day, but this is the reality that we live in now. So moving on. So Katie, you ended, I think, sort of with where I wanted to pick up and sort of have Craig pick up, because beginning in 2018, ISIS began to experience this massive reversal of fortune. And some of it was clearly brought about by international pressure, by the global coalition, by sort of the military force that was applied by the international community. But some of it was local. And so one of the most interesting to me and least explored things is, what are the internal problems that cropped up for the group, in terms of the administration of the state? Because it's one thing to have a lofty vision of a rightly guided caliphate. It's another thing entirely to do things like provide medical services and take care of sanitation and things like that. So this to me is sort of a question that I think is fascinating. Can you talk about that a little bit?
I sure can. Question. I think they had some internal problems, to be sure. Ideologically, they had a lot of trouble. There's been some really good articles written on it. Cole Bunzel and a few others. Morale, economically, they struggled. But I think the problem for us as outsiders looking in, there's a low bar for insurgent governance, and they kind of jumped over that bar. And they're also competing against governments around them that are literally kill their own citizens. So, it's really hard to evaluate. Their bureaucracy, I think it's somewhat legendary for groups like this. And when you look at it in archives and I'm working on the ISIS files under GW's program on extremism. And, at first I'm like, oh, this is just kind of mundane bureaucratic stuff. What are we going to get out of it? It's actually pretty fascinating. I don't think that's where their real problems are. Like, actually, that's probably a strength for them relative to their environment, their neighbors, and other groups, right? I mean, who's doing it better than them? Not too many. Again, it's a very low bar, so I'd rather not focus on that. I think their problems came from their strategy. And again, that's something that we kind of focus on in different strategies that they've had throughout their lifespan to date. One, and I'm sure Alberto's going to talk to some of this, but the coalition that's put against them is very powerful, and it's quite efficient, and it is very effective. And that is really what crushes them. So I think we have to remember that is that's something to think about. There's a lot of good diplomacy and a lot of good military campaign planning that went in that's been overlooked, and I think will get the attention it deserves, right? Both from a conventional side in Iraq, so reducing urban infrastructure or urban defenses. So that was very tough, but it was done. But also the unconventional side in Syria, where the US military says it worked with its best proxy partner ever. And that's been a weakness for the United States. The United States has not done well working with proxy partners around the world. And here they found one that was relatively successful, at least in the short term. So really the seeds, all of that was sown by the Islamic State. Right? The Islamic State created the impetus for all of these things that could happen. The strange thing, and Alberto alluded to it earlier, I could see an alternate future, like a counterfactual, where the group conquers a Sunni majority state in parts of Syria and Iraq, but doesn't provoke the U.S. into intervening, right? It doesn't threaten the consulate in Erbil. It doesn't commit atrocities, and it doesn't exhibit its genocidal behavior. And you wonder if there would be a, also they don't do external terrorist operations against Europe and other places. These, now it's really hard to separate their ideology from their strategy, going back to the previous discussion, because it's in their nature. This is what they are going to do, but it's a mistake, right? It's a strategic error of immense, at the height of complete success, they've culminated and don't know it, and then overreach, and then sow the seeds for their failure. So for me, that's the causal factor for achieving a caliphate against all odds, and then completely blowing it due to really just some strategic errors on Abu Bakr's part, right? The person who gets a lot of credit compared to his predecessors for building and creating the caliphate, and yet he's the one who clearly loses it. So that's one thing, and I think their strategy is kind of weird. I mean, they talk a lot about Dabiq and starting creating conditions for the apocalypse to happen or whatever, but from a strategic perspective, I think they really thought that they could deter Europe and the United States from intervening in and kind of give them enough space to finish their political project, which they worked very hard over 10 years of work to get to it. And it was just a fantasy. It was never going to happen, especially when they acted the way they did. European partners are still with this coalition because they have no desire whatsoever to have any kind of territorial control done by this group that would then foster or facilitate external operations directed against their homelands. And so, these are some really, I think if the strategists within the upper echelons of the Islamic State got to be kicking themselves on one hand, and also how do we do better next time? Yeah.
No, thanks, Greg. That's perfect. And I think it segues very naturally to what I wanted to ask Alberto, which is, so Greg, you outlined sort of the inside game, which is sort of, the problems that cropped up in terms of administration, in terms of ideology, and sort of, having the ideological fantasy meet the sort of the more seamy reality for the Islamic State in terms of administration. But there is an argument that says that the Islamic State could have muddled along, or it could have muddled along for much longer, at least, if there wasn't this sort of external pressure. So that's what I wanted to ask you, Alberto, in terms of, what does the international effort look like? What did the international effort look like? Who was involved? What were their objectives? How did we create this consensus? And I say we sort of communally, but in terms of the pressure that was applied on the Islamic State. Wait, hold on, Alberto, we have to pin you and unmute you. You have to unmute. Perfect.
Yeah, it's Craig raised the point just a little while ago, and I think it's true. It could have gone a different way. I was in government at the time, and 2014 was the year of after the fall of Fallujah. This is the junior varsity team. The ISIS declares this caliphate. Does the U.S. immediately say we're going to go all out against them? No. It doesn't happen then. It begins to happen later. Threat against the consulate in Erbil, as was mentioned, the genocide against the Yazidis, which is seen by American satellites in real time as it's happening. And so, it kind of bites off more than it can chew in a way which provokes a response by the Americans. And the Americans began to build this coalition. And even though the previous administration, yes, called it the JV team, they very quickly realized that they have a challenge. And they worked very hard to form this coalition over 80 countries and together. And I was in many of those meetings at a kind of working level, and they covered everything. I mean, there was finance, there was propaganda, there was all basically any aspect of the problem that you could look at. You had a mechanism, and you had a kind of a format to address it, and they both had kind of real world negative consequences now, but the Americans made the decision they understood that we needed deeply motivated local proxies to fight the Islamic State. Basically, you need revolutionaries to fight revolutionaries. And that was the Iraqi armed forces and the militias, which often were basically, these very, very extreme Shia militias, which are a bane on the political existence of Iraq to this day, and a huge problem in Iraq at this day. But this kind of rose up, with Sistani's fatwa and all of this, and the professional Iraqi army. And then you had the SDF, YPG, PKK, who are as revolutionary, as committed as ISIS. And you have the great defeat, kind of emblematic defeat at Kobani, which is basically emblematic of that. It's Kurdish YPG ground troops and American air power, and the Islamic State basically, declaring victory and we used this in propaganda. It was great. They actually had videos declaring victory inside Kobani, Ain al-Islam. And it kind of blew up in their face. It didn't turn out the way that they wanted to. So this has continued, this kind of mechanism of cooperation across lines. So you had American air power and a guy named Qasem Soleimani working to break the siege of a town in northern Iraq, a largely Shia Turkoman town in northern Iraq that was besieged by the Islamic State. So Amirli in northern Iraq was not taken because Qasem Soleimani, who we later, liquidated, and American air power worked together to eliminate, to break the siege. So it really did bring about a kind of a coming together of all kinds of strange bedfellows, but it kind of worked. And so we're kind of still in that. The mechanism still more or less exists. The meetings are still happening. There is some kind of cooperation that occurs to that. The mechanism is still going. But of course, you don't have the urgent kind of high-grade issue of the Mosul Raqqa caliphate that we had then. This kind of state. It's hard to maintain the momentum when it's about, kind of people being killed in Mozambique or Congo. Kind of how do you maintain the focus on that going forward? That's a big question, I think.
No, that's great. And let me sort of shift gears a little bit and sort of pick up, Katie, where you left off. Because you were talking about sort of the cohort that came together to build the caliphate, or at least to build the external sort of military of the caliphate. The really interesting thing to me is, since last March, right? Last March was the sort of the formal declaration that the caliphate is over, or at least the caliphate stage is over. But what we're discovering is maybe not so much, right? In terms of the fact that the group, even though it's lost territory, has lost maybe not all of its salience, both in terms of messaging, but also in terms of the physical power that it has to sort of to project force to abroad to shape events. Can you talk a little bit about what was left, right? Sort of, we are now in a situation where we're thinking very clearly about sort of a post-caliphate era, but when the caliphate came down, sort of what was the group left with, right? If it's not territory, what is it?
Great questions. And I won't rehash the argument from March 2019, but I think when you listen to what analysts watching the Islamic State at the time were saying, they were saying, sure, we've gotten rid of the physical caliphate, but the Islamic State leadership has already prepared for this. The United States announced in 2014, 2015, that we were going to remove the physical caliphate, and that's what we went forward doing. And the Islamic State had years to prepare for the shift. So we had seen a shift in terms of how the Islamic State was talking about the caliphate. It no longer was just the physical terrain, but there's this idea of the virtual caliphate where wherever you are a believer, you can establish the caliphate there, and we're more than just Mosul or Raqqa or Baghouz. And the kind of shift from the Islamic State meant that it was prepared for this defeat. It knew that it was going to lose militarily to the Iraqi forces inside of Iraq, and then in terms of March 2019 to the Syrian Defense Forces, the SDF, that the US had partnered with to take back Baghouz. And that defeat was just, again, a temporary setback. So I think, looking at what Craig and his co-authors pulled together in the ISIS Reader, there's a very clear line in there, and I don't know the page number, I'm sorry, but where the Islamic State and its predecessors are discussing what victory looks like. And for ISIS members, victory for them is when the caliphate is here to stay, and they're willing to die. And there's this idea that there is going to be more fighters to come that actually mirrors an image that KSM, Khalid Sheikh Mohammed, had presented to his interrogators from right when he was captured under the CIA, where he's talking about the long line of martyrs that stretch back from him to the Prophet himself. So this idea that there are people who are willing to die for Islam is not new, and the kind of concept is it will keep going until Islam is victorious. That's the ideology, and that fundamentally is what we did not counter and what remained after the Islamic State lost. The ideology is what allows the Islamic State to continue to put forward. It sets forward a strategic doctrine that the Islamic State is following. It's modifying it, of course, but if you take that doctrine and marry it with some of the skills that Craig was talking about, the strategic military skills and the capabilities on the ground, we can start to see how this comes forward again. I think we only need to look at Al-Hol refugee camp to see the return of the Islamic State inside of an internationally supported camp, right? Where we see these females within the camp that are policing others according to the writ of the Islamic State. They do not need some other group to be controlling the land to say a decree that this is governed under the Islamic State, to live by the way of the Islamic State. I think that's the key difference that we have missed. In terms of fighters, of course, right, we still have between, I think the estimates now are 14 to 18,000 Islamic State fighters inside of Iraq and Syria. That does not account for the branches themselves. There are over 20 branches and networks globally. When we're talking about where those fall, they are across Africa, across the Middle East, across South Asia, and into Southeast Asia. So the Muslim world broadly, the Islamic State has now populated with its tendrils and is working to establish itself there. And then financially, Islamic State was certainly set back by its losses inside Iraq and Syria, but it no longer has to pay for the caliphate. So the fact that it doesn't have as much of an income is offset by the loss of the economic demands on an Islamic State government, if you want to call it that, that needs to fund an administration. When we're talking about what it is today, the Wall Street Journal just published a great report looking at ISIS finances, saying that Treasury says about 300 million in assets. The UN Security Council is a little bit more conservative in terms of its estimate, saying about 100 million, at least 100 million in assets. But when we're talking about money, the Islamic State's not hurting. It had prepared for this. It's tapped into trafficking and trade. It's still getting oil revenues, and it's got investments globally that it's able to benefit from. In addition to, of course, the revelations that it's not new to any analyst watching this, but that it's using cryptocurrency to finance its operations. So when we're talking about what is left of the Islamic State, there's a lot still there. The leadership is intact. Craig had a great panel last week with the CTC talking about the new caliph and why it's not a surprise that we have not seen his face yet. We still have the strategic methodology. Many of the capabilities still exist in various forms, and the branches themselves are quite strong and are growing in many areas globally.
No, that's perfect, and I think that gets us very nicely to sort of to where we are now, right? With the current present reality, because the thing that strikes me in what all of you have said is how much this is an ongoing conversation. It's an ongoing conversation about resources. It's an ongoing conversation about ideology. It's an ongoing conversation about messaging, but it's also an ongoing conversation about activity. And in recent months, we've seen alarming signs of life from the Islamic State, even in the territory that was once known as its core caliphate, right? And this echoes the sort of the warnings that the US military has been giving for a long time about the need for a countervailing force. And in the absence of a countervailing force, an ability on the part of ISIS to reconstitute. I guess this is the $64,000 question for me, Craig. Is what we're seeing in Iraq and Syria now, is this really an ISIS comeback? I mean, how much there is it right now? Is the Islamic State really able to roar back in a way that's a significant threat to US interests and to the interests of our allies?
Yeah, sure thing. First, I'd like to, that's a great question. First, I'd like to just note that the people in the audience it's a pretty distinguished audience you got, and they're the same people I read, so it's not surprising that they're here listening to Alberto and Katie, because, I don't know, that's what professionals do, I guess. So thanks for all being here. Unfortunately, we have seen them bounce off the bottom, if you will. I'd be careful to spend too much time trying to analyze these trends. Just I always keep an eye on it, but I don't necessarily, what they're doing is often indicative of where they're at in their life cycle, and you have to compare it to different stages of their lifespan. I think these attacks mean certain things, but like I said, in others, it's more their strategy about dominating local scenes, which are so those attacks would be much more important to me than symbolic terror attacks against the government, which could be either a sign of extreme weakness or someone they want to punish. It's really hard to make out. So there's a little bit of noise out there, but they have bounced off the bottom. As Katie said, they made a successful transition to insurgency that was telegraphed for years. And I think that was their plan once they realized that people were serious about taking Mosul back. And they probably felt a little more confident about Syria, but once Mosul's invested and it looks like it's going to be taken, you can see them establish a rear guard and then start getting the important people out of there. And like I said, they were surprised by how effective we were in Syria, I think, with our local partners and proxies that Alberta lined up. And that was probably the double blow for them. What did our transition look like is what I'd ask, right? I mean, it looks like CT efforts in Iraq, at least with a functioning government there on that half, is finally hitting its stride, but it's years after the transition. Like, how are they able to transition? And yet it seems like our transition is like, okay, now we're done the conventional fight and this and cleaning up. Okay, now we're going to get to training up the CT forces again. Like, yeah, it's too late. The transition's already happened. So what we have is the residual attacks that they're going to have is what they're going to have. I don't think it's not determinative how successful they're going to be, though. They've been here before. They recuperated faster this time than last time for probably a lot of different reasons. But I don't think it doesn't necessarily speak to the potential they have, because we saw the same type of activity in, let's say, 2010-11 to be imprecise. But the U.S. withdrawal provides this space for them to grow. And without the U.S. capabilities there, they're able to grow and expand at a really rapid manner, almost exponentially, as if they were patiently waiting for this. And they are patient, as Katie pointed out as well. Their leader's quiet, much like Abu Bakr was between 2010 and 2012, just waiting. There's no sense him just, running his mouth, for lack of a better phrase. He doesn't have anything to say. When he says stuff, that's when I'd pay attention about. They feel confident, at least, in their abilities to take this to the next kind of stage of insurgency. But to me, what's really both impressive and scary is their ability to maintain external provinces and affiliates. To me, that was the major test. Again, something that I think Katie alluded to. This is their major test, and Adam had the same question in the chat, which is like, well, what does losing the caliphate do to them? It should have had. It might not have an impact on an insurgency in Iraq and Syria, but it certainly should have had an impact on the global affiliates. This was their chance to say, no caliphate, we're going to go back to our local concerns and do business however we want without someone telling us what's going on from Iraq and Syria. And when there's no break there, that worries me for a variety of reasons, but largely legitimacy reasons. One of the things, Mia had a question there about, what does it do? How does it interact with some of these groups, or how does it absorb other groups or forgive groups that it's transgressed? I've been spending some time this summer looking hard at how they got back in good graces with insurgents in Iraq and in Syria post some real conflict that they had with them, like complete, in some cases warring with certain factions. They're a lot more pragmatic and, willing to, let some bygones be bygones, depending on the level of takfir and their attitude towards takfir at that particular time ideologically. Sometimes it gets very hard-edged, and that's self-defeating for them. Other times, they've welcomed tribes back into the fold very pragmatically, while holding their nose. And that's a sign that I don't like to see, to be honest. So I think the last thing to think about, as they come out of this defeat, and I do think it's a defeat, just all defeats are, temporal. They can be temporary. They're temporary in nature. They can be permanent. But this one's kind of early to tell. Their ability to maintain a local fight in Iraq and Syria as their core kind of central area for a lot of reasons, ideologically, but also, who's in the group, who's running the group, that kind of thing. But their ability to do that and a global fight at the same time it's concerning to me that they've been able to do that, despite the pressure on them that Alberto just described, which I think is going to go down in the history books as a very efficient, effective campaign against non-state actor, proto-state, whatever. The question is, can the U.S. and its partners do great power competition and fight global jihadist insurgency at the same time? I'd love to say yes, but a lot of pundits are out there saying, let's scrap everything we learned and thought about, or even doing today, and let's get this laser strategic focus on great power competition. And if we can't walk and chew gum at the same time, then we're gonna, this group's gonna. That's what they're waiting for. That's the opportunity they're looking for.
I think that's a great point, and it's almost as if you and I correspond and we share these concerns with one another. But you did mention ideology, and I'm struck by the fact that, Alberto, what you talked about before about the sort of the decline, relative decline of the Islamic State, and the fact that it's harder to message is obviously a thing. It's much more of an inside conversation, right? A competition between the Islamic State and Al-Qaeda. But if you look spatially, if you look across the broad swath of the greater Middle East and North Africa, what you're seeing is still, I think, relatively alarming in terms of messaging, in terms of the ability of these messages to mobilize and inspire, maybe not on a scale that we saw in 2013 and 2014, But what's the message now? What is ISIS trying to say? How is it trying to remain relevant? Oh, are we still up? Yep.
Yeah,
Perfect.
yeah. Well, I would say that you're right. I mean, the decline in their media capacity is only in relative terms compared to their height. The capacity that they have, despite all the efforts against them by governments, by social media companies, etc., they still have a massive presence. It's just much, much smaller compared to what they had at their height. But it's just like all those arguments which Craig and others everyone has noticed is that the defeated or declined ISIS of today is a certain degree, 10, 20, I forget the number, degrees larger than the defeated ISIS of 2010. So in relative terms, we're better off, but actually the trend lines are not good. I worry particularly when it comes to messaging that revolutions are made by ruthless and focused political minorities. And the region, the kind of the petri dish where they will rise from, all the pathologies, all the dysfunction, all the disconnects, everything that led to their rise is still there in one way or another. I mean, in some places it may be hotter. It was hotter in 2012 than today, say Syria. But all the elements of the Syrian civil war, for example, are still there. All the disconnects and the tensions that exist, and not just in Syria and Iraq, but throughout the region. In fact, one could make the case, and I would make the case, is that the region today is more dysfunctional than before, which means that the possibility of kind of them being able to pick off a weak actor or surge, not in the places that they are most known for, but maybe in places that they were less known for, in other Sunni majority Arabic-speaking countries. That's something that I worry about, because I think when we talk about the stage that we're in, what we call the war of attrition, it's attrition right against everybody, kind of those that are fighting them, but we're not being attrited very much. But the danger is that we're going to lose, our attention span is going to go elsewhere, and that will give them, and kind of turbulent situation which exists in the region will give them time, and they are waiting for an opportunity to develop that they will be able to take advantage of, knowing that they have all their ideological, military, and propaganda building blocks more or less intact.
No, I think that's a great point. Let me, I know we're running out of time, so let me sort of focus the last question for what'll have to be the last question for this session to Katie, because Craig, I think, brought up something really interesting, which is the sort of this inherent tension between thinking globally and acting locally, right? And how a lot of these franchises are still, they're acting locally, but they're still tethered in some way to sort of the larger ISIS idea, right? And it's not necessarily an either or proposition. It's not necessarily that they have to choose local action or a global vision. But what's interesting to me is the degree to which with the decline, relative decline of the core caliphate, we're seeing a repositioning of ISIS, not a sort of a dissolution of ISIS, but a repositioning into other regions. So that's my question to you. Sort of, what are we seeing? We've squeezed ISIS really hard in the core caliphate of Iraq and Syria, and they've gone elsewhere. Where have they gone? What do we need to look at?
I think just before I launch into where the Islamic State has gone, I want to make a point that I've been trying to push forward about the difference between the Islamic State global leadership, if you will, so the caliph and the very senior leaders, and the Islamic State in Iraq and Sham, or Iraq and Syria, however you want to denunciate the ISIS acronym, the local leadership. So we have tended to conflate, as we did actually with Al-Qaeda as well, the difference between the global leaders who are leading a transnational organization and the fate of the group in which they are finding sanctuary. So this circles back to whether or not the Islamic State globally is on decline. We crushed its most successful node, yes. But what we did not do was go after the ability of the Islamic State transnational network to use its other nodes to remain strong. And that's why, as we saw the Islamic State being defeated, particularly inside of Syria, the media arm kind of ramped up production about the Islamic State elsewhere. And its most successful branches today are inside of Africa in particular, and they had been completely forgotten for years. So, right, when you're looking at the claims of allegiance and the swearing of bayat to Baghdadi that occurred right after he declared the caliphate, the groups inside of particularly Western Africa and the Sahel were somewhat ignored for a long time before the Islamic State even recognized them publicly. But now they're being held up as these great success stories. So what I'm talking about here are Islamic State in the Greater Sahara and Islamic State in West Africa, based out of the Lake Chad Basin, and then Mali, Niger, Burkina Faso Triangle in Western Africa. Those two groups, which are referred to as a single group in Islamic State media, but actually are two different organizations on the ground, have been the most successful Islamic State branch, I would say, outside of Iraq and Syria, with the exception of Afghanistan and some other Islamic State branches that fell onto really already developed nodes. And the Afghanistan group was interesting because it skyrocketed initially as being a very strong Islamic State group. It was part of it was basically a splinter from the Taliban that declared allegiance to the Islamic State, but it has since been decimated. And it's now one of the weaker affiliates, though the Islamic State certainly still makes a lot of money from the trafficking routes that ISIS or Islamic State Khorasan sits on in Afghanistan. So that leads to another observation. As we're talking about the Islamic State, the places where it's strongest tend to be places where there is low-level conflict, particularly where there are grievances that are community-based, whether those are ethnic identity groups or religious sectarian lines, where there is an identity that is being marginalized by the state. The Islamic State has been able to co-opt and insert itself into low-level insurgencies and try to stoke them to recreate what it made inside of Iraq in particular. The challenge for the Islamic State abroad has been where Al-Qaeda has been successful. So Afghanistan, I started off studying Al-Qaeda, and I will always describe myself as an Al-Qaeda analyst. Afghanistan is the Taliban and Al-Qaeda and the Haqqani network in, of course, the South. But the threat to the Islamic State has been both from the US and Afghan forces and also the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. And that's one of the things that has weakened the Islamic State inside of Afghanistan. In Yemen, the Islamic State never really got off the ground. It conducted the deadliest attack inside of Yemen in Yemen's history as a terrorist group. But the Islamic State is still numbering very few on the ground. It doesn't have the type of support that Al-Qaeda in the Arabian Peninsula, the group that has attacked the United States multiple times and was behind the recent Pensacola shooting, has gained inside of Yemen. And then same thing in Somalia, where Al-Shabaab, which is an Al-Qaeda affiliate, is strong. The Islamic State inside of Somalia, again, made some early errors. It's really isolated within a sub-clan in northern Somalia, hasn't been able to get out. It's claiming attacks down in Mogadishu, but those are grenades being thrown. That's not something that requires a robust logistics network. So when we're talking about where the Islamic State is strong, it's fundamentally in areas where it's been able to get its roots in. And just to kind of project forward, the Islamic State, having not succeeded inside of Somalia, is now developing really a province down in Mozambique and kicking off an insurgency that is increasingly threatening because it threatens to link the Islamic State nodes east and west across Africa. And we're watching efforts inside of Libya And then, of course, the Islamic State province in Sinai, which is still going strong.
No, thank you, Katie. That was fabulous. And I think, unfortunately, I have millions of questions. I had actually prepared a fourth round of questions asking you guys everything from, sort of the inter-jihadi competition between Al Qaeda and ISIS, all the way to what the likely impact is of the pandemic on recruitment, on messaging, and things like that. We're going to need to save that for another time because we are out of time. And I wanted to thank you guys. This has really been a sort of a fascinating conversation. It's given me, and I'm sure all of the attendees, a lot of food for thought. Let me just end with just a couple of housekeeping items. As I mentioned, this is the start of a series that's linked to our World Almanac of Islamism project. You guys will be getting emails about future installments, which will cover everything from the changing nature of the Muslim Brotherhood to what Katie was just talking about, the rising Islamist activity in Africa, to sort of other topics as well. If you haven't already, please do so. Please visit AFPC's website at www.afpc.org. Look at our work on this, and also visit our Almanac project. It's almanac.afpc.org, where you can read all of the chapters that Katie has helped out on, that Alberto has helped out on, that Craig has helped out on, really sort of an immense intellectual contribution. And finally, as a shameless plug for one of our new products, we have pivoted, like many other institutions, as a result of the pandemic, and we've launched a new video and podcast series which comes out twice a month. It's called AFPC Insights. You can go on the AFPC website and figure out how to subscribe there. You can go to your preferred podcast platform, whether it's iTunes or Stitcher or something else, and sign up there. But there's a lot of really, I think, timely and important conversations that we're trying to have with our scholars, with our professionals, with our affiliates about what's going on in the world today. It's not all about the Islamic State, but this conversation today, I think, was stellar in outlining that dynamic nature of the conversation. So I wanted to thank all three of you again for spending an hour 20 minutes of your time with us and helping us to learn. So thank you guys very much. I look forward to seeing all of you soon, hopefully in person. Until then, I will see you in just a few weeks at our next webinar. Thank you guys so much.
Thank you all. It was a privilege.
Thank you.
Thank you.